Thank you for joining us today. I pray that our time together will help you experience Jesus and to share His grace. This week, we're starting a new sermon series. We're going to be looking at the book 1 Timothy. That's in the New Testament. It's a letter written by the Apostle Paul to his protege Timothy about the mission work that Timothy was doing in the city of Ephesus. So go ahead and be turning with me in your Bible to 1 Timothy chapter 1. We're going to be reading verses 3 through 5. We're going to start there and then we're going to unpack the lesson together. So 1 Timothy chapter 1 verses 3 through 5. Hear the word of the Lord. I urge you, as I did when I was on my way to Macedonia, to remain in Ephesus, so that you may instruct certain people not to teach any different doctrine, and not occupy themselves with myths and endless genealogies that promote speculation rather than divine training that is known by faith. But the aim of such instruction is love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a sincere faith. The word of the Lord. Now, as we look at these few verses in the first chapter of Timothy, there's some things that we kind of need to know what's going on. And we see in the first few verses that Paul has sent or left Timothy in Ephesus to kind of straighten up some things that have been going on. Paul helped plant the church in Ephesus. It was near and dear to his heart. We see the story where he's there with the Ephesian elders in Acts, and he gives them these comforting words like he's never going to see them again. And so Paul has a huge heart for the people of Ephesus and the church there. And so what we see is that something is going on in Ephesus that's kind of corrupting the way that the body of God was behaving and what they were believing. And like we talked about in Titus, sometimes our culture dictates how we worship God. Some ways that's understandable, and some ways it's very detrimental, and how we understand God can get perverted and diluted into something that isn't who God is. And like when Titus was dealing with Crete, they made God into the image of Zeus, and they were very proud of Zeus. Well, it's not Zeus that the Ephesians have fallen in love with. It's not Zeus' story that is affecting the Ephesians. That's not their culture. That's not their worldview. And what we're going to look at is we're going to see what is it that is causing and empowering Paul to send Timothy to fix this problem. What is it that they're wrestling with, so that he instructs him very strongly in the first few verses to instruct good doctrine. We see that. And he wants them to move beyond myths into truth, not just stories, but truth. And he wants Timothy to do those things, but to be rooted and focused in love. The whole aim of Timothy's presence there in Ephesus is to be love. And so we want to start there and kind of to try to figure out what's going on in Ephesus that really has called for this strong letter to Timothy and to the church in Ephesus on how they are to live to be Jesus people, and not just products of their culture, but to be products of Jesus Christ. So what I want us to do, I want you to kind of see what the scripture says about what's going on. False teachers are arising, and they're influencing the people of God to compromise their faith in Jesus by trusting in myths, trusting in genealogies, basically trusting in their behavior or their legalism. What they do, what they don't do, the check mark. There's lots of possibilities that we think these myths are and these genealogies are. And we'll see what Paul has to say directly through this book to those false teachers. And we're going to kind of dig a little bit and see kind of what is influencing their thought processes here as we go. But I do want to spend some time, maybe a little bit more time than you're going to be comfortable with, about what I believe is the problem that's deeply rooted in the Ephesian culture that is creating all of these problems, that is messing with the Ephesian psyche to how it is to worship God and to be the people of Jesus. You see, before Christ was shared in Ephesus, it was a pagan stronghold. There was a long history of pagan worship for many, many years. Ephesus was an ancient city and had lots of influences. And then we see later that the Jews, the Hellenized Jews, as the Greek influences come into the Ephesus, the Hellenized Jews had a stronghold. They had a presence there in Ephesus too. So you have these pagans and you have these Judaizers that are all living together in Ephesus, trying to wrestle with what pleases God, who is God, and what exactly does it mean to live a life pleasing to the divine. What I think specifically the Ephesian problem is that there is this mosaic, this combination of syncretism of what it means to follow God. They were taking a little bit of this pagan history, and they're taking a little bit of this Jewish history, and they're trying to take a little bit of this Christianity and mold it into some sort of theological cocktail that would be pleasing to them. And it's kind of crazy that the faith has become so diluted they don't know what's true anymore. So they follow these mythologies and these stories of gods and goddesses, and they try to take a little bit of this and take a little bit of that, maybe like a casserole theology or a cafeteria style theology, and it's getting all mixed together, and it's not really resembling paganism. It's not really resembling Judaism, and it's definitely not resembling Jesus Christ. And so this identity crisis that's hit the Ephesian church, I think is in part because of the theological culture that they were focused on, and they're trying to have Jesus and Artemis too. They're having to kind of decide who is Lord. Is Artemis Lord? Is the emperor Lord, or is Jesus Lord? And so you're going to see this Jesus is king as we go through this, and who is really in charge? Is it the pagan God? Is it the Jewish God? Is the emperor? Or perhaps, as Paul postulates, is it really Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords? So I want you to buckle your seatbelts, because I want to share with you some of the things that I've learned as I'm looking at the history of Ephesus and the way that they view God, and some of their stories and their myths that I feel are important for us as students of this letter, because Paul is writing to object to this false doctrine. We kind of need to know what are some of these doctrines, and how could they possibly be influenced by the culture, so that we can read Scripture understanding the problem in which he is talking to. You know what I'm saying? Awesome. So first off, I want us to kind of explore some of the goddesses, the pagan aspect of worship that was in Ephesus at this time. We recognize in Scripture, in Acts especially, we see that there is this goddess that they worshiped in Ephesus called Artemis of Ephesus, and Ephesus housed one of the hugest temples to Artemis, which was seen as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And so you could say that a lot of their culture, a lot of their livelihood, a lot of their thought process focused around who Artemis was. Their economy was tied to making sculptures of Artemis. Their economy was focused around people coming to visit and worship the temple of Artemis. So you could not go very far in Ephesus without seeing the temple of Artemis, hearing about the temple of Artemis, seeing people working for the temple of Artemis. And it just affected their everyday life. I mean, it's almost like trying to get around Southern California without seeing an In-N-Out or a Del Taco. I mean, there's somebody, you know, somebody that's worked there, or you've been there recently. It's everywhere. And so the temple of Artemis was everywhere in Ephesus. The theology of Artemis was everywhere. So it's important for us to recognize who this Artemis was and kind of what it might have to do with how they understand who God is. So what I've learned about mythologies is a lot of times they're very ever-changing, particularly between the Greek and the Roman gods and goddesses, because they shared a lot of the similar stories and the backgrounds, and they like to try to create a mosaic of who their god was, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so Artemis was actually the combination of 3 different deity stories that Ephesus had made their own. They borrowed some from here, they borrowed some from there, and they sculpted this image of a goddess who was in control, and she was important. That's why they focused their life around Artemis. So the first person that they kind of based Artemis on is upon this old ancient goddess known as Sybil. Now, Sybil was not a Greco-Roman goddess. She was more of a native indigenous goddess that was way back in the day. And Sybil was seen as a mother of gods, kind of like this blending of air and land, and she was birthed, and she was seen as kind of like this mother of life, of plants and animals and people. And some people have compared her Sybil to perhaps a more modern understanding of the goddess Gaia. What we see from Sybil was not a mothering god. She was the source of life, but she was not at all mothering. In fact, her story takes a really weird twist. When she was created, she had both genders. She had both biological parts. And because of that, the cosmic powers were jealous, and they emasculated Sybil and made her into a feminine god. So hang on to that image. I know it's not one you want to deal with, but it's going to come back. This emasculation image. And so she begins to birth plants and animals and all these different things, and she creates humanity, and then there's this one human that she falls in love with, this mortal named Attis. Now, I don't know what it is about Attis that just wins the heart of Sybil, but he had the audacity to try to marry another mortal, the daughter of a king. And so Sybil comes to this wedding, and she drives everybody mad, including the one she loves named Attis. Now, Attis has gone crazy, and he runs out into the wilderness, and he's hurting himself, he's flagelling himself, he's hurting himself, he's cutting himself, and eventually he reaches this point where he emasculates himself and he dies. And where he dies, this almond tree begins to grow. Now, this is more mythology than you've ever wanted to talk about. I totally understand. But I want you to see something about this image. You have this strong woman god who is seeking love, and she is jilted. Yet despite of his death, she convinces these cosmic forces to resurrect Attis. And in so doing, those who were doing the ceremony to resurrect Attis, those priests actually had to emasculate themselves, and their blood was a part of the resurrection of Attis. Sybil has Attis resurrected, and he becomes a chief priest in the cult of Sybil. This ancient goddess, some of her story blends into the creation story of Artemis. It's a little convoluted because they're taking some Roman mythology along with this ancient mythology. And what you see here is this woman who longs to love, yet remains single because of this jilted love from Attis. So she's scorned, a woman scorned. And so throughout the ages, these Sibylline priests, in order to be the high priest of that cult, guess what they had to do? They had to recreate the resurrection rituals of Addis, which means if you wanted to be a high priest in the order of Sybil, you had to emasculate yourself, or there could be a different sacrifice, that of bulls, that there could be a sacrifice there. And so you see that this image of power and taking away power from others is seen here in Sybil. But that's not the only story, the mythology about Artemis, that I want to focus on, because Artemis, with the Greeks and Romans, they had some different stories about how they blended together. When you see classical understandings of Artemis, she is the goddess of the hunt. She is one of the virgin goddesses. She is all about tied to fertility rituals, which also Sybil was tied to fertility rituals as well. So if they wanted prosperity or power, they would pray to Artemis, because Artemis was not just the goddess of fertility, she was the goddess of a hunt. You have the combination of masculine and feminine in Artemis, just like you did in Sybil. But Artemis wasn't even to be affected by love, unlike Sybil. They took that part out of Sybil and made Artemis where she would not fall in love. Aphrodite's charms would not plague her. And so you see that these images of Artemis and Sybil in their sculptures, they're shown very similarly. This very strong woman figure, and how that she didn't need men. What Sybil did after the situation where she had her man, but there's this struggle of power over man, this struggle of emasculation, and there's this image of self-sufficiency. But it's not just self-sufficiency. It goes to the further extent where there's no need for mankind. One of the ancient poets, Kalanos, wrote about the founding of Ephesus, and he doesn't follow the Sybil mythology. He doesn't follow the Artemis mythology. He follows the Ephos mythology. The mythology of Ephos was this, that she was queen of the Amazons, and that she founded Ephesus. And if you know anything about the Amazons, they were the strong women. They were like these divine women characteristics who had no need for men whatsoever. The men weren't allowed in their society in ancient Amazonian concepts. Men were just used for breeding. They weren't even a part of society. That was all they were good for. So this ancient poet writes about the founding of Ephesus with this strong woman type who is about the subjugation of men. You see this story of emasculation, self-sufficiency, the no need for men. And you're going to see how that their view of what a family looks like and what social roles are were completely different than what some of the other Near Eastern cultures would. And this lens would affect what Timothy is going to have to address. And here he is, a young man sent into this country that is struggling to know what their identity is, who they believe God is, and what does it mean to follow God. And so Paul is encouraging Timothy to teach truth, move away from these mythologies, but you don't go around and telling people they're going to hell. You don't beat them into submission. That the aim of this instruction that Timothy's been given is love. To live out the gospel story through Timothy, through his teaching and through his behavior, so that he can show them this loving God. Not a God focused on power and emasculation and making other people suffer. That he wants to show a crucified God, one who's willing to pay the price, to be the sacrifice for his people. Now, we talked about Sybil, we talked about Artemis, and we talked about Ephos, and we also have this other train of thought that's going on in Ephesus too that Paul, it seems, to address, and that is this Hellenized Judaizing faction. So Hellenized means Greek. So there are these Greek Jews, and there's this group of them because Ephesus had a Jewish population there. But there seems to be this group of Hellenized Jews that are coming into the church at Ephesus, and they are being legalistic. And they're trying to get the people of God to focus not just on following the Torah, but they're focusing on restricting marriage, which we see that, in some of Artemis and Sybil and Aphos, this lack of marriage. Somehow these legalistic Hellenized Jews are saying, no, don't marry. And they're also throwing in this thing about dietary restrictions. Don't eat this, don't eat that, which we see in Judaism some, but we also see in some of the cults of Sybil and the cults of Artemis, this restriction of what you can and can't eat. And so we have all of these pagan ideas blending with these Judaizing legalists, and it's starting to influence the Christian way of thought. Do we really need marriage? Who's really supposed to be showing the way of Christ among the people? Are we supposed to be focusing on who's rich? Is that whose story wins? Or do we focus on who's loving? What are the stories that we need to believe? Is it the stories of Sybil, Artemis, Aphos, the Hellenized Jews? And Paul says, no, it's not about those mythologies and genealogies. It's about the gospel of Christ. And he wants Timothy to instruct them, to teach good doctrine. Now, I recognize that phrase, teach good doctrine, is basically saying teach good teaching. But what is the good teaching? And Paul provides us with that. He gives us what it is to be good teaching. And what is found, it is the aim of such instruction is love that comes from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. What he's wanting them to get is that God has revealed himself through his word. And his word reveals the word. That's Jesus. And it's not about who has the most power, who has the most possessions and prosperity. It has the most willingness to sacrifice, this purity of heart, not animosity, not fear, but purity in heart. This good conscience. He goes on to say that some had given themselves to an unclean conscience, and he's written them off and delivers them over to the evil one. We see at the end of chapter 1. So this good conscience before God is important. Not just to take all these myths and believe them, but to focus on Jesus. And with a sincere faith. Faith. The response to Jesus should be faith. Not doubt. Not frustration with these other mythologies. That we believe in Jesus as the Son, the King of Kings. Not all these other pagan identities. It's not about doing it yourself. It's not about legalism. It's about trusting in the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ. We're going to talk more about that next week as we look at Paul's confession and song to Christ in 1 Timothy 1. I know I've thrown a lot of information at you this morning, but what I want you to see is we need to understand what's going on theologically into the city of Ephesus. What is causing people to say, I don't want to be married? They were actually, a group of people were running around saying, I'll have illicit sex with lots of different people. I don't see the need for monogamy. There were people running around binding dietary restrictions on people and saying, well, you can't be a Christian if you eat like this or that or the other. And so we need to understand that this is coming from the pagan understanding of who Artemis is and how big of an influence she is in Ephesian culture. We need to know about the Jewish influence of the Hellenized Jews, because those around Christians at that time were often coming from the Jewish camp and some pagan camp too. So it's this blending and mixture of all these ideas about who is God, how to please God. And Paul is really wanting to simplify the story. He wants them to get away from myths, stories that you can't prove. He wants to get them into teaching what is good, focusing on Jesus and the traditions that they've been given concerning sacrifice and Jesus. But above all, Paul says, this is rooted in love, for without love, you cannot please God. You can hold the right beliefs, but if you don't hold that belief in love, Paul writes to the Corinthian church that it's all for nothing. It's not just who you believe in, it's how you live your life of belief. Paul says you can be following Jesus, but if you don't do it in love, then you've missed the point. And so he encourages Timothy to encourage the church to focus on Jesus and to focus on love and to let all this other stuff, this legalism, these made-up gods, to let them go. Be freed from that. Now, you may be thinking, this has nothing to do with you. I'm here to tell you that we live in a very pluralistic society. And what that means is our attitudes and information about God come from lots of different sources. Sometimes we like to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that from different cultures and different things, and we make God in our image, and that is not supposed to be. I've confessed before how I oftentimes thought of God as more like a Zeus character, always waiting to punish me. But when I come to understand that God is reflected the best in Jesus, and that Jesus is one willing to sacrifice himself, and that God the Father is a good Father, he's not wanting anyone to perish. In fact, God is love. Then I had to situate and rethink about how I looked at God, and it changed how I lived for God. Paul is encouraging Timothy to help his people reimagine who God really is, and that would change how they lived their life. There would be no struggling for power. There would be no looking down on people because they don't have any money. There would be no strife amongst themselves based upon who's right and who's wrong. Who's eating this, who's not getting married, who is getting married. Paul wants to free them from all of this confusion and get them back to truth. The truth of Jesus. Not the truth of our opinions, but the truth lived out in the life of Jesus Christ. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I pray that all of this can help us understand Paul's writing to the Ephesian church through their pastor, Timothy. I hope that you take something from this. Be blessed.